to join us. So just please bear with us for a little bit. Okay. All right, let's go how we're doing now. Okay, 10 more seconds and we'll start. All right, fantastic. Hi everyone again, and welcome to Taking Science Practicals Online at the University of Adelaide session. Today we have with us Professor Simon Pike, Deputy Dean of Internationalization, from the University of Adelaide, and Stacey Keating, Director of Student Recruitment, Kaplan International Pathways, Australia and New Zealand. This session will give you an opportunity to dive into the University of Adelaide Faculty of Science and experience how student success has been supported when they were unable to attend face-to-face practical classes. You will hear how they have been able to innovate and adapt to continue offering science degrees in an online delivery format with highlights on their biology, zoology, physics, and winemaking classes, and many more as well. All right, without further ado, I'm passing over to Simon.
Thanks, Lydia, and thanks everybody. It's great to be sharing with you. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes just giving you a little bit of background, and then I'll give you some examples of some of the things that we've been doing at the University of Adelaide. The University of Adelaide is a research-intensive university, and the Faculty of Sciences covers a very wide range of different disciplinary areas. So we do agriculture, food, science, wine, chemistry, all the way through to veterinary science, high energy physics, and pretty much everything in between. So when we had to stop teaching practical classes, which for us was actually in week 3 of our commencing semester of study, that was a really, really significant challenge. Now, one of the reasons that it was actually such a major challenge was in fact that for our practical classes, they are a significant part of what we actually do. And as luck would have it right now, my screen share has decided that it doesn't want to advance. Hang on a sec. Huh. In fact, the whole thing has decided it wants to freeze. Hold on one moment, please, for a second. Let's just see if we can get that to work again. And here we go. Excellent. I love it when computers don't do what they're supposed to do. So practical work is actually a really significant component of the curriculum in the sciences at the University of Adelaide. And students typically spend anywhere from around about 20% of their in-class contact time at first year, and that's quite common, all the way up to 60%. In some cases, it's even higher than that in their third year of study. So we actually highly value the practical experience that our students actually gain. So when we suddenly were unable to teach face-to-face classes, this actually became a really significant challenge for us, because a significant part of the learning that our students do is actually in their practical classes. So to start with, I've just got a little poll for you. So Lilia, if you could actually roll that first one out. And the question is, do you think that science practical activities need to be delivered face-to-face? And this was actually the genuine question that we ourselves were grappling with when this actually happened. So please do respond. You're in control, Olivia.
Yes, absolutely. I can see that we have most of our attendees responded, who have responded already, but we're still waiting for a few. Let's give them a couple of seconds to see if they would like to contribute. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to end the poll now, and I will share the results with everyone. Let's see.
So, in fact, what you actually think is exactly where we were just about a year ago. We strongly believed that face-to-face was the way that we needed to be able to do this. Thanks so much for that one. Let's actually move on. So, in fact, this is exactly the kind of difficulty that we were having. And it actually really comes down to this whole question. Oh, it's going to do it again, Lilia. It's frozen again. Here we are. Let's see if we can get it to work. There we go. So the question was, when we needed to transition into this new space, what could we do to support student learning when in fact we were prevented from face-to-face instruction? And we had around about 4 days to actually turn this around, to go from no face-to-face classes, so from being in face-to-face classes to not being allowed to teach any face-to-face at all. So we actually had a very, very small window of time to actually make this really quite substantial change. So what are some of the things that we did? Well, I'll give you some examples and then I'll come back a little bit at the end and just make some observations. So the first thing was that in our first year biology class, so this is a large class, so we teach anything up to 1,000 students in first year, so we actually have a significant practical challenge, logistical challenge in terms of actually teaching our classes. And so what we did here, and on the left-hand side, this is actually our photosynthesis experiment. This is the experiment that all of our students do. And so what some of our staff did was they actually ran the experiment, they filmed them running the experiment, and they shared the film, the video with the students. So the students could actually see what was going on. Now, that's a little bit removed. This one on the right-hand side, in fact, is a much cleverer way of doing it. This is actually also an experiment from our first year biology class. And what's going on here is this is actually an osmosis experiment. And what you can see there is actually a small tube that has red blood cells in it. And depending upon what solution the red blood cells are put in, the cells will actually stay intact or they will actually lyse, they'll fall apart. And the way that you actually know that they fall apart is because you can actually see the writing through where it's currently orange, you can actually see the writing come through. So what the people who were filming this did was they actually got the students who were watching this to actually time how long it took. So the students were actually collecting the data that was actually remotely being delivered by the people who were actually in the laboratory at the time. And again, this particular class has 550 students in it, so there were 500 odd students who were tuning into this. They were actually collecting the data and they were actually participating in exactly the same kinds of things that they would normally do. They just didn't actually have to set the experiment up. In our first year physics, again, we have a very strong reliance on practical skills, and we made really excellent use of simulations in this particular case. Now, this is actually a commercially available package, and what they're doing here is simple mechanics, and the students actually have control over a whole lot of the parameters, and they were given a particular problem that they had to solve without actually being told which things were the critical parts. The students actually had to play around with this whole system. They needed to work it out, and then they could actually determine exactly what was going on. In many ways, this is an online replication of exactly the experiment that they would be doing if they were actually in class for real. In our botany and zoology classes, what the students usually do or have done in the past in this particular space is that they actually have to create an insect collection. And this is normally done on campus, it's done in groups. And so in this particular case, they actually did this as a take-home experiment. So the students were actually asked to do exactly the same experiment, but to do it in their own local environment. And so they literally go out and they collect bugs, and they have to actually record what they've found, and they have to actually make all sorts of observations about what they've actually been doing. And the really interesting thing about this, of course, was that there's about 100 students doing this course, and of course they live in different parts of the city. So in fact, their insect collections varied dramatically depending upon where they actually lived. So in fact, we actually got more value out of this experiment than we normally would. And in fact, I think probably that they're going to keep this particular format of this online, of this semi-online task in the future. And this was actually scaffolded and supported with Zoom sessions with the students to actually help them get into it. We also made use of a number of commercial packages. So for example, here our anatomy and physiology classes made really excellent use of Pearson's mastering product. And this virtual dissection that you can actually hear, it's not exactly the same as the students actually exercising the skill themselves, but they still actually do have to pay attention to all of the little details about what is actually going on. Student feedback on this one was really excellent, and they did actually find when the students got into the lab that they very quickly picked up the actual practical skills that they didn't have the opportunity to develop, but they actually had the learning about all of the things that they were actually expecting to see. So in many ways, this was actually an excellent preparation for their classes. These ones so far are reasonably stock and standard. Now we're actually getting into some of the slightly more interesting area of this. So in our geology classes, so we have a very strong geology program. One of the things that they actually did was, for this, was that they actually created themselves a whole lot of virtual 3D models that the students could actually manipulate in real time. We actually made use of a virtual microscope. So again, the students actually had control over what they were actually seeing, and they had the ability to zoom and pan and all those kinds of things. And then on the right-hand side, this is one of my colleagues, Professor Alan Collins. He actually went out into the field and did all of the things that the students would normally do, and he set it up so that he videoed himself doing all of this, and he explained exactly what he was doing and took all the measurements and observations that he would normally do, and that was provided back to the students. So the students actually got this sense of what a real-world geologist actually does, and instead of them actually going out and into the field themselves, at least they had the opportunity of actually seeing all the things that Alan himself did. And again, we had really excellent feedback from this particular prac, not least because Alan's a wonderful teacher, and so the commentary actually as he's recording this is just, it's brilliant. It was absolutely fantastic. Then we get into the now into the more senior years. We have a really strong agriculture program, very famous agriculture program at University of Adelaide. And what they decided to do in this particular space was, rather than the staff actually conducting many of these kinds of field work exercises, the people that you actually see here are actually commercial farmers. So these are commercial growers who are actually in their own spaces, and they are actually talking to the students about what they would actually do given the particular scenario that they're actually faced. So now what we've got here is we've got experts, and not just academic experts, but in fact the people who are potentially going to become the students' employers, actually walking them through a range of scenarios and how to do particular things. So for example, on the right-hand side, you can see that they're about to prune a fruit tree. Now, for an orchardist, that's a very, very important skill to learn how to get that right. The two gentlemen there they're experts, and so they actually talk their way through and how and why they actually made decisions. So part of this actually allowing the students to actually see the professional practice and the professional thinking that's actually going on. It's not just the cut the branches on the tree, it's what effect cutting that particular branch on the tree will actually have and why you do it in this particular fashion, rather than if I made the cut here, this would be the consequence. Again, the student feedback from this was absolutely fantastic. So even though they couldn't do it, they actually really got excellent opportunity to see what's going on. And of course, the really valuable part of this is that these videos actually now are an archive, and the students can actually go back and make use of those. And we've had excellent feedback on that as well. Now moving into some of the really exciting ones. So the University of Adelaide has a very, very strong and historically well recognised winemaking program. So winemaking is actually a very, very hands-on activity, as I'm sure that you can actually appreciate. And so what you can actually see here is a Zoom tutorial class where the students are actually, and you can see here and up on the top left-hand corner, you are actually witnessing a virtual wine tasting. And not only is this a virtual wine tasting, but what our staff actually did, so just in the second square on the top row from the left, that's Professor Paul Grabin. He's our chief winemaker. They actually packaged up samples of all of the wines that they wanted the students to taste, and they posted them out to the students, and then they had the tutorial class so that everybody is actually tasting the same wine. So they could actually do all the things that they would normally do when they're actually in person, but they actually were doing it virtually. And let me say that we have people in, I think this particular tutorial group, in 9 different countries in the world. Okay, so this is a truly international virtual wine tasting. Brilliant idea. The other thing that these students do is that they actually, they run a project. They actually are in charge of, each group of about 10 students are in charge of a small batch fermentation to make their own wine. Now, they were not able to come onto campus and to actually participate in the normal way. So what they did was that Paul and his team took all the measurements, They sent the measurements back to the student group. The students would make a decision about what the next step was. They would send that back to the winemakers, and the winemakers would do exactly what the students asked them to do. They would then take the next set of measurements, and they would go through this process. And each group, they were doing this sometimes 4 and 5 times a day, because this actually runs on a 24-hour basis. Now, incredibly complicated and for the staff actually in the winery, but again, the students actually had real-time feedback, and they made real decisions as they would have if they were actually in the winery themselves. Very exciting, that one. The last one is probably my favourite. This is a good friend of mine, Richard Mulak. Richard is a chemical engineer, and he actually works in our viticulture and enology program. And he's actually in charge of one of our courses, which is all about brewing technology. And he actually set up a number of industry experts, so we got videos, but the thing that I really love about this one, and you can actually see here, this is Richard's brewing kit. Now, he actually made, I think, 15 of these kits and actually sent them out to the students so that the students could brew along with him. So, you know, in kitchens, in back sheds, in bathrooms, actually even in one case, in a bedroom in shared accommodation, students were actually able to undertake their brewing project in real time with assistance from Richard, who would actually come in for a tutorial usually twice a day, because if you know anything about fermentation, when it's actually doing its thing, making small changes is really, really important. And so the Zoom support there and the how-to videos and the kits, again, strongly engage the students in this particular activity. And again, we had really excellent feedback from the students. They really enjoyed doing it. Okay, Lilia, time for the second poll.
Absolutely, it's coming now.
So the question here is, do you still think that we need to do face-to-face in order to actually deliver practical activities in the sciences? Over to you.
Do you have different opinions?
You are allowed to change your mind.
Yeah, let's give it another 5 seconds or so before we share the votes. All right, and finishing up on 2 seconds. Here we go. All right, so I'm sharing the results now.
Not bad, not bad. Let me say that that is actually, you're slightly more pessimistic than some of my colleagues were, because many of my colleagues were very convinced that this would never work. But in fact, as you know, some of the things that I've shown you here, it did actually work extraordinarily successfully. So just a few comments from me just to wrap up. And again, it looks like it's going to die. Don't do that. Yeah, okay. So sorry, I'm just going to have to stop that for a moment and just, oh, here it is, there it is. So one of the things that we learned here is that a large number of our academic staff did actually respond to the challenge of no face-to-face in a range of extraordinarily innovative and creative ways. And this did allow many of our practical activities to successfully engage the students, and we actually have had a number of our students who've completed their courses of study remotely because they actually couldn't come back to Adelaide at all in 2020. Students were very appreciative of the time and the effort that staff invested on their behalf, but I will actually say not every practical activity can be moved online. We tried a number of things that I didn't talk about here that didn't go so well. And so what we've had to do with some of those students is that at some point they will actually have to come back to Adelaide and complete some of their practical activities. So I hope that's actually been really helpful for you. And Stacey and I are very happy to take your questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simon. This is absolutely fascinating, to be honest, because just seeing that students are still able to do such excellent things while studying remotely, that's absolutely brilliant. So I think the University of Adelaide have done a fantastic job achieving this. While we're waiting for some questions to come through, and just as a reminder, please do pop them into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen, just down there. And while you're thinking of any questions that you may have, I have a couple of questions of my own as well. So Simon, you obviously mentioned that the students have been very appreciative of the effort that has been made. And has there been like any sort of, maybe negative feedback, or, it's generally been very positive? How have the students responded to this change in circumstances?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think the students for whom it was the hardest in many senses were actually our first year students, because they were 3 weeks into their university experience and all of a sudden we just said, go away, we can't see you anymore. And for many of them, and I have a number of family friends who are just starting university, they found that quite a struggle, because they were trying to adapt into the differences that tertiary study is relative to where they've come from, and they didn't actually have that time to settle. So for them it was really a really substantial challenge. Challenges that we actually had, yes, we have students who didn't have particularly good internet access, for example, or didn't have technology that was sufficiently modern enough to be able to run the videos and some of the simulations that we did. So we actually had technical issues for a number of students. The university actually put money into providing equipment for students that were actually, weren't able to access those kinds of resources. Some students, I've got to say, just don't like being online. And I'm sure that for many of you as well, as it is for me, being online for 8 or 9 hours a day is incredibly tiring. It's actually much harder than being face-to-face. So they were the kinds of comments that we got back from students. It wasn't exactly the same. The other thing, of course, is it's much more difficult to build a peer group in the way that practical experiences usually do in the sciences, because you're often working directly with somebody else. So it was those kinds of comments that we mostly got in terms of the negative side. And again, sorry, one other thing, not every course was able to put material online. So my own discipline in chemistry, for example, we did put material online for first year, but the nature of our practical courses, it really just doesn't lend itself at second year and third year. So we just had to delay those. And the students were, they were forgiving. They recognised that there were challenges. We did run some things. I ran one of my courses remotely, and it actually worked pretty well, but it wasn't as good as face-to-face.
Thank you, Simon. Still, I believe it's such a fantastic adjustment to the circumstances that really do not depend on us, right? So that's still really good to hear that the majority of students enjoy themselves. We've got a question from Sogir. How students will be assessed for online classes?
So that's a really good question. So one of the things when I was talking about the geology pracs, and I pointed out the virtual microscope and the tools that they actually had to actually manipulate and look at models, they were actually used in the assessment tasks as well. So not only did the students use them in their practicals, but they actually then got to use them in their assessment. And a number of our courses actually made use of those same tools in the online assessment. So all of our assessment in both semester 1 and semester 2, sorry, our formal examinations were online. They were non-invigilated, non-proctored, and open book. So that was a massive, massive change for us. And that was probably one of our biggest challenges, was actually switching our thinking into asking what I actually consider as an educator were much better types of questions, because we actually gave students the information and we said, well, what would you do next? So it was actually a much more authentic experience for the students. We had a few issues, but again, assessment always throws up interesting issues, but we did try and make use of all of the things that we had learned in offering these online pracs to make sure that we actually matched the assessment in the same fashion.
Thank you, Simon. We've got another great question from Ricard. When we return to normality, obviously we'll see what it looks like in the future, will the University of Adelaide incorporate some of these new approaches to practical learning into the curriculum, or will you return to the old way of doing things?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. My greatest fear is that we will backslide, let me say, and that we'll go back to the way that we were doing things before. We have learned a tremendous amount of new ways of engaging, I think, really effectively with students. I think we'll actually go to a blended model, so there will be some things whereby the online or virtual were fantastic adjuncts, but they probably aren't the entire replacement, if I can put it that way. So yes, there will be some things where we will actually have the students come back in. For example, one of the places, a really good example, the virtual winemaking, so where the students actually were telling the winemakers what to do remotely. That was incredibly stressful on our staff. The effort that they actually put in to do that was just astonishing. And the biggest challenge with that one is that it's actually not sustainable from our perspective. So it was incredibly effective from the student's perspective, but as a model of actually running in the future, we simply couldn't do that again. So it was, well, we could if we really needed to, but it would not be ideal. So our intention is absolutely to draw on the best parts of what we learned, blend them with the best things that we were doing previously, and actually build something that we think going forward is actually going to be a better experience for our students and will actually demonstrate the learning we really want them to have.
Thank you. And just a question for both you, Simon, and Stacey. What is the current plans for the 2021 intakes?
Yes, that's a really good question. So right at this moment in time, so the latest that we have is that we will be teaching our practical classes face-to-face. But of course, that could change on a moment's notice. But we are actually hoping that we will actually be able to do exactly the kinds of things that I've just been talking about, that we will actually be using this blended approach, because semester for us starts in another couple of weeks, and we're in full tilt getting ready for it right now. Stacey, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, from a pathways perspective for the University of Adelaide College, we have committed to delivering online for the full academic year of 2021. That's an absolute confirmation of that, where we teach the program solely ourselves. We do have, because of the way our programs are delivered, some of those programs are actually taught by the university themselves. So there are some outstanding, I guess, decisions later in the year, to Simon's point, that we don't have absolute certainty on those. But for the most part, our programs are fully mobilized to an online environment. And we've committed to that for the full academic year of 2021, which actually goes through to, close to February 2022. So quite a way off in the distance. And just make a quick comment. I really wanted to have an opportunity today for the University of Adelaide to showcase the way that they have innovated in such an amazing way in really what was a very, very short space of time. For context, the Australian border closed, or we had closure for our Chinese students coming in for our main intake, which is our February intake for 2020, about this time last year. So we've been in this for quite a while, impacted our main intake, and the university and the college really only had a matter of weeks to shift everything to that online capacity. And so, I kept hearing all these really great experiences that particularly sciences were offering for our students, because from a recruitment perspective, I was hearing from agents a lot when we would talk about our commitment to online. They would say, but, not everything's online, right? And I think you all responded to that in the same way with that initial poll, saying that 80% of you felt that, practicals could only be delivered face-to-face. So I think the University of Adelaide really, challenged that and really came up with some great learning outcomes and experiences for the students. So just wanted to say I'm so pleased that we could showcase those for you today, and I hope you enjoyed experiencing those as well.
That's fantastic. Well, huge thanks, Simon and Stacey, for being our panelists today. It was a really fascinating session, even for me being a host as well. So I really found it particularly interesting, and I hope all of our attendees enjoyed it as well. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to let our attendees know what the following sessions are for them today. So you will have a choice in 15 minutes time at 11 a.m. UK time of admission sessions. You join either admission sessions for the UK pathways or the admission sessions for the US. So please do join one of those. And after the session is finished, please take a few minutes to fill in the feedback form, which will launch at the end of the session. When you click continue, it will take you to the events website where you can complete the survey, join another session, or use one of the very many engagement functions, such as group discussions, networking, or the trivia challenge. And just another small reminder as well that at midday today, UK time, at 12 p.m. that is, we also have a coffee and chat session available. So if you would like to pop around and have a conversation with Kaplan colleagues and ask some questions or just maybe participate in some discussions, please do so. But this is all from us for today. And just once again, huge thanks to everyone who has attended. And of course, thank you, Stacey and Simon.
Thanks, Leah. It's my great pleasure.
Thanks, Lilia. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.